They called it the Land of Promise, a vast expanse of untouched wilderness stretching as far as the eye could see. For the settlers, it was a realm of dreams, a place where they could begin anew, shake off the burdens of their past, and carve out a home in a world yet unclaimed by others. They were a hardy band, a mix of families, trappers, and wanderers, drawn by rumors of rich soil and plentiful game. With wagons creaking and livestock braying, they set off into the dense woods with high hopes, carrying supplies, tools, and enough courage to face whatever might lie beyond. The forests were thick, ancient, with towering trees that loomed like silent guardians of a forgotten age. Sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Even during the day, shadows twisted and danced around them as they moved deeper into the wilderness, and every now and then, the silence was broken by the sharp crack of a branch or the distant hoot of an owl. Birds chirped and squirrels scurried across fallen logs, but it wasn't the usual clamor of woodland creatures. Here, even the animals seemed hushed, wary of something unseen. The settlers were undeterred, for most had already survived their share of hardship. They joked and laughed, masking the flickers of apprehension that grew in the back of their minds as they went deeper. Despite their initial enthusiasm, some of them couldn't help but notice the unease that crept upon them, like an invisible weight settling on their shoulders. They'd heard stories from the townsfolk on the edge of the forest, tales told in hushed whispers around fires, of strange things seen in these woods, creatures that moved in the night, figures glimpsed out of the corner of one's eye, only to vanish before they could be fully seen. But those were just tales, they assured themselves, just the superstitions of people who had grown up too close to the wilderness. Yet, as they continued, some among them found it hard to ignore the oddities. Strange markings appeared on tree trunks, claw marks too large for any known animal and spaced too high above the ground. A few members of the group paused, tracing the marks with their fingers, trying to determine what could have left such a sign. Others dismissed it, eager to keep moving, fearing the nightfall in this unfamiliar land. Still, the air seemed thick, carrying an almost electric charge, as if they were intruding into a world where they didn't belong. By evening, as they made camp by a small clearing, a sense of fatigue had settled over them. Not merely the physical weariness from a long day's travel, but an inexplicable heaviness, as if the forest itself were watching them, waiting. They unpacked their belongings, set up tents, and built a fire that cast long shadows across the clearing. As darkness fell, the firelight danced across their faces, revealing expressions that had grown more somber and withdrawn. They spoke less, their voices muted as if they feared being overheard by the trees themselves. One of the men, a grizzled trapper with years of experience in the wilderness, began to tell a story about a lone hunter he'd once met, a man who'd come back from these very woods with tales of something big, something unnatural. Most chuckled, dismissing it as one of the old trapper's yarns, but a few shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances into the encroaching darkness around them. Above them, the stars blinked into view, distant and cold, their light scarcely reaching through the dense canopy. And in that vast silence, as they huddled around the fire, each one felt it, a quiet, pressing sense of unease. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hidden within the shadows, watching. The fire crackled, sending embers swirling up into the darkened sky, but it did little to calm their nerves. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest shifted. What had been gentle rustlings and distant calls grew faint, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The usual nighttime noises, a hoot of an owl, the scurry of small animals, even the whisper of wind through the leaves, faded as if smothered by an invisible hand. They were alone, surrounded by an oppressive quiet that hung over them like a shroud. The trapper, noticing the tense expressions around him, leaned forward, his face lit eerily by the glow of the flames. His voice dropped to a whisper, and his gaze flickered to the surrounding woods as if he expected something to appear from the darkness at any moment. "There's a reason the locals keep clear of these parts," he murmured, almost to himself. "They say these woods are old, older than any of us can reckon, and sometimes old things don't take kindly to newcomers." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Some of the younger men scoffed, dismissing his words as mere campfire tales, but the older ones, those who'd spent more time out in the wilderness, stayed silent, their faces set in thoughtful frowns. They knew better than to dismiss warnings, even if they came wrapped in folklore. As if on cue, a faint, haunting howl drifted through the trees. It wasn't the familiar call of a wolf or a coyote. This sound was different, deeper, rawer, as though it came from something larger, something that belonged to a time before man had ventured into these lands. The settlers froze, their breaths catching as they strained to listen, hoping it had been their imagination. But there it was again, echoing through the night, closer this time. The sound wound through the trees, carrying an unsettling edge that sent chills down their spines. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the howling ceased, leaving them with only the rapid thumping of their own hearts. One of the women, clutching her child close, whispered, "What could make a sound like that?" Her eyes darted toward the trapper, who remained silent, his face grim and shadowed. He didn't answer, perhaps because he couldn't, or perhaps because he didn't want to. Then, one of the men, a tall and skeptical sort named Samuel, stood up abruptly, his expression defiant. "There's nothing out there but animals and shadows," he declared, his voice louder than he intended, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "We're letting our imaginations get the better of us." Yet, even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, and his gaze drifted toward the darkness beyond the firelight where the trees stood like silent sentinels. The shadows seemed to deepen, to thicken, almost as if they were listening. A cold wind swept through the camp, stirring the branches and extinguishing a few of the embers. The settlers shivered, drawing their blankets closer around them, feeling the bite of the chill and something else, something that wasn't merely the cold. As the night wore on, sleep eluded most of them. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle in the underbrush made them flinch, their senses stretched taut. Some clutched weapons close, others whispered prayers. They felt exposed, vulnerable in a way they couldn't fully understand, as if the forest were a living entity, breathing around them, watching with a patience that was both ancient and unsettling. When the fire finally began to burn low, casting long shadows that danced across their faces, a figure rose among them. A young girl, barely old enough to understand fear, pointed toward the trees and whispered, "I saw eyes in the dark." The settlers turned, their gazes searching the shadows with wide eyes, hearts pounding with dread. For a moment they saw nothing, only the dense blackness of the forest. Then, there, a glint of something, barely visible, like the faint reflection of light on glass. It was gone in an instant, but the impression it left was unmistakable. A hush fell over the camp as they stared into the darkness where the girl had pointed, each of them straining to catch a glimpse of whatever had reflected back at them. The fire sputtered, casting flickering shadows that made it hard to discern where reality ended and imagination began. Some among them held their breath, hoping it was merely a trick of the light. Others gripped their weapons tighter, silently steeling themselves for whatever might come. But nothing emerged from the shadows. The glint, or whatever it had been, faded as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the thick night. A few of the settlers exchanged nervous laughs, dismissing the sighting as childish fancy. "Just firelight playing tricks," one muttered, though his voice held a note of unease. The young girl, still staring toward the trees, didn't seem convinced. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, her eyes wide. "It was real, Mama. It was watching us." Her mother shushed her, pulling her close and whispering reassurances that did little to calm her own nerves. As they settled back down, each of them tried to convince themselves there was nothing to fear. But the atmosphere had changed. The sense of safety the fire provided now seemed flimsy, inadequate against the creeping darkness that surrounded them. Just as they were beginning to relax, another sound broke the stillness, this time closer, sharper. It wasn't the deep, haunting howl from earlier, but rather a loud crack, like a branch snapping under heavy weight. All heads whipped toward the direction of the noise, eyes searching the darkness with renewed fear. "What was that?" one of the men whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. No one answered. Instead, they listened, each heart pounding like a drum. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, as if it too were waiting. Another snap echoed through the night, followed by a series of low, heavy thuds, as if something large were moving through the underbrush. The trapper stood, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. He signaled for silence, his face set in grim determination. "Stay close to the fire," he said softly. "Whatever's out there doesn't like the light." For a few tense moments, they waited, watching, listening. Then, through the trees, they caught a glimpse of a massive shape just on the edge of the fire's reach. It was barely visible, more of an impression against the darkness. A broad, towering figure that moved with an unnatural quietness, gliding between the trees as though it were part of them. Several settlers gasped, and a few backed away, their faces pale with fear. The shape hovered just beyond the firelight, and though they couldn't see its face, they felt its gaze bearing down on them, an intense, almost tangible presence that sent chills through their bodies. It lingered, silent and watchful, like a predator sizing up its prey. Samuel, the skeptic from earlier, took a tentative step forward, squinting into the shadows. "It's just a bear," he said, though his voice trembled. "Probably just curious about the fire." But as he spoke, the shape shifted, standing fully upright, towering even higher than any bear they had ever seen. Its silhouette was massive, unnaturally so, with long, powerful limbs and a broad, muscular frame. And then, slowly, it raised a single arm, extending it toward them with a deliberate, almost taunting motion, before retreating back into the darkness. A murmur of terror swept through the group as they watched the figure melt away into the forest. They exchanged glances, each of them struggling to comprehend what they had just seen. Bears didn't move like that. They knew. Bears didn't stand so tall, nor did they linger just out of sight as if testing the courage of those who dared to enter their domain. The trapper spoke in a low voice, barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "We're not alone here," he said. "Whatever that was, it's watching us. It knows we're here." The settlers huddled closer, their bravado stripped away, replaced by a raw, primal fear that none of them could shake. They realized then, in the heavy silence that followed, that they had ventured into something beyond their understanding. And for the first time since they had entered the forest, they felt the full weight of what it meant to be intruders in a land that didn't want them. They kept the fire burning high through the night, feeding it with whatever wood they could gather nearby, their eyes darting constantly toward the shadows just beyond the flickering light. No one spoke much now. The weight of what they'd witnessed left them in a collective silence, each person wrapped tightly in their own thoughts, each thought steeped in dread. Whatever courage had propelled them into the wilderness seemed to drain away with each passing minute, replaced by an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. In the early hours of the morning, when the fire had dwindled and the sky had just begun to lighten, a young man named Elias, the son of a farmer, noticed something peculiar in the soil near their campsite. Kneeling down, he brushed his fingers across the ground, frowning at what he saw. Massive footprints, far larger than any humans, pressed deep into the earth, leading from the trees toward the campfire and then away again, disappearing back into the woods. He glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but most of the group was either dozing in restless fits or pretending to sleep, eager for a reprieve from the anxiety gnawing at them. Elias cleared his throat softly, his voice trembling as he called out, "Come! Come look at this." Several people groggily approached, rubbing sleep from their eyes. But the moment they saw the footprints, their drowsiness vanished, replaced by wide-eyed horror. The trapper crouched beside Elias, studying the marks with a grim look. "No animal leaves prints like these," he muttered, tracing the outline of one of the massive impressions. The shape was unmistakable, roughly humanoid, but with toes spread wider, longer, each print as large as a man's torso. A ripple of dread ran through the group. For all their attempts to rationalize what they'd seen the night before, here was undeniable evidence that something beyond their understanding had come close, closer than they ever wanted it to be. In the quiet, oppressive stillness of the morning, they realized the creature had approached in silence, watching them as they huddled by the fire, creeping in and out without a sound. Samuel, the man who had tried so hard to dismiss the night's events, looked as if he'd aged overnight. His bravado was gone, replaced by a haunted expression. What does it want?" he whispered almost to himself, but everyone heard him, and the question hung heavy in the air. The trapper shook his head slowly, his jaw clenched. Maybe it's curious, or maybe it's warning us. He looked out into the woods, his gaze distant, as though trying to discern some hidden message in the shadowed trees. We're trespassing on its land, after all. A low murmur passed through the group, several of them nodding, others shuffling their feet uneasily. The settlers had always thought of themselves as brave, pioneers conquering an untamed wilderness. But now, with this evidence laid out in front of them, they began to feel less like conquerors and more like interlopers, unwelcome guests in a place that didn't belong to them. One of the women, an older widow named Margaret, stepped forward and spoke up, her voice trembling but resolute. "We need to leave," she said, casting a wary look at the trees around them. "Whatever that thing is, it's letting us know we're not wanted here. I don't need to see it again to understand its message." Others murmured their agreement, glancing uneasily at the looming trees, as if the creature might materialize from the shadows at any moment. Yet even as they discussed retreat, the realization sank in. They were deep in the wilderness, days away from the safety of the nearest settlement. If they left now, they'd be at the mercy of the forest and the creature that seemed to know its every corner. Still, the thought of staying another night in this place was unbearable. As they packed their belongings, hastily extinguishing the fire, an unspoken sense of urgency guided their hands. Each one of them felt the intense, pressing need to leave, to escape before the creature returned. If, indeed, it would ever let them go. The settlers moved swiftly, a nervous energy driving them to pack up their meager belongings and leave the cursed campsite. The early morning light filtered through the trees, thin and gray, casting a ghostly pallor over everything. They stayed close together, glancing over their shoulders as they walked, as if expecting the towering figure to reappear at any moment. The forest seemed different now, its familiar sounds replaced by a profound silence, as though the land itself sensed their fear and was somehow complicit in it. Despite the weight of exhaustion pulling at them, the group pressed on, their footsteps quick and hurried. No one dared to linger, not even to gather food or water. They'd forgo provisions if it meant putting distance between them and whatever creature had prowled so near the night before. In their minds, that massive shadowy shape was all too vivid, its silent, watching presence lingering in their thoughts. But the forest wasn't keen on letting them leave so easily. As they navigated through the thick underbrush, familiar paths seemed to vanish, replaced by unyielding walls of trees and thickets they didn't remember from the day before. They tried to orient themselves, recalling landmarks and checking their compass, but it was as though the forest had shifted, reshaping itself overnight to trap them within its depths. Every direction they chose seemed to lead them in circles, back to where they'd started. Their frustration mounted, voices rising as they argued about which way to go. The trapper did his best to calm them, insisting they focus and stay alert. "The forest can play tricks on the mind," he warned, his voice steady but strained. "Panic won't get us out. We need to stay sharp and keep moving." But it was becoming painfully clear that something was wrong. Trees they could have sworn were unique markers reappeared with unsettling frequency, their gnarled branches and unusual shapes unmistakable. The deeper they ventured, the more disoriented they felt, as if an invisible hand were steering them away from escape, guiding them further into the heart of the wilderness. As midday approached, their hurried steps slowed, weighed down by exhaustion and fear. Each one of them could sense it now, a pervasive feeling that they were being watched, herded, almost, by something unseen and intelligent. A feeling of helplessness began to creep into their minds. The sense of being out of control, of being a pawn in some unknowable game, turned their fear into quiet despair. Margaret, who had been the first to urge them to leave, stumbled and sat down on a fallen log, her face pale and lined with fear. "We're not getting out of here, are we?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias, standing nearby, shook his head, trying to keep his voice steady. "Don't say that. We'll find our way. We just need to keep going." But his tone lacked conviction, and the others noticed. They could all feel the same gnawing doubt. The sense that they were lost had settled over them like a dark cloud, stifling hope and replacing it with a bone-deep dread. Suddenly, from somewhere in the dense trees, they heard a soft rustling, as if something were moving just out of sight. They froze, exchanging fearful glances. The trapper held up his hand, signaling silence, and they all strained to listen, hearts pounding. The rustling stopped, only to start again moments later, this time closer, the sound too rhythmic to be mere wind. A twig snapped sharply, and Samuel, ever the skeptic, stepped forward, his jaw set in anger and fear. "I've had enough of this!" he shouted into the woods. "We're not afraid of you." His words echoed, swallowed by the oppressive stillness that followed. And then, just beyond their vision, a low, rumbling growl emerged, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air and chilling them to the bone. It wasn't a sound of warning. It was a sound of something asserting dominance, a reminder of their place here, as intruders, trespassers who had no right to be in this land. Samuel stepped back, his defiance drained, replaced by a cold realization that he'd crossed a line. The settlers gathered closer, their breaths shallow, unable to look away from the darkness ahead, where something large and unseen waited, biding its time. They didn't speak, for there was nothing left to say. The settlers barely dared to breathe, each heartbeat hammering like a drum in their ears as they remained tightly clustered together. The yellow eyes continued to flicker in and out of view, moving fluidly around them, as if the creature were sizing them up, deciding how and when to strike. It was almost worse than a direct attack. The waiting, the watching, the creeping inevitability of it. They could feel themselves unraveling under the weight of it, every passing second tightening the grip of terror around their hearts. Elias, clutching a small hunting knife, looked at the trapper, his voice barely a whisper. "What do we do if it comes for us?" The trapper's face was taut, shadows deepening the lines of his expression. He glanced around, weighing their slim options, and spoke softly but firmly. "If it charges, we hold together, keep the fire between us and it, and make ourselves as big as possible. We'll scare it, or at least try." Samuel let out a brittle laugh, the kind that escapes when the mind flirts with panic. "Make ourselves look big? Do you see how big it is? It won't be scared of us. It's toying with us." A shudder passed through the group. Samuel's words hit home. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't reacting with the fear or caution they might have expected from a bear or any other known predator. This was something else, something that seemed to relish the power it held over them. Its slow, taunting movements weren't random. They were intentional, calculating, designed to push them deeper into a corner of despair. Margaret tightened her hold on her daughter, who had been clinging to her side, wide-eyed and silent. "Hush, Samuel," she whispered harshly. "You're scaring the child." But in truth, they were all beyond scared. Fear had become a living thing among them, sinking into their bones, rooting them in place. The creature was now circling wider, its heavy footsteps occasionally cracking a branch, the echoes bouncing in the silence. Every sound, every glint of those eyes felt like a mockery, a demonstration of its total control. The trapper took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Listen," he said, speaking as much to himself as to the others. "We can't stay here. We're in the open. It's just waiting for us to be vulnerable. We need to find a place to barricade ourselves, somewhere we can keep it out." He scanned the surroundings, his gaze settling on a rocky outcrop a little ways back, where a narrow crevice between two boulders might provide some shelter. He pointed. "There. We'll move, slowly and carefully. If we can get in there, we can buy ourselves some time." Reluctantly, they nodded, their eyes darting between the shelter and the creature's last known position. Moving as one, they began to inch backward, step by cautious step, keeping the fire between them and the creature. The eyes watched, following their retreat, but the creature didn't attack. It let them go, as if amused by their desperate attempt to find safety. When they reached the narrow opening, they scrambled inside, pressing their backs against the cold stone, the sheer relief of having walls around them temporarily outweighing their terror. But even as they settled, they knew it was no real haven. They huddled together in the cramped crevice, pressed against the rough stone, their breaths shallow and eyes wide, listening intently to the sounds outside. The narrow shelter offered only a small measure of security, but it was enough to provide the illusion of a barrier between them and the relentless presence stalking them. Shadows gathered thickly around the entrance as the last light of day faded, plunging the forest into a dense, nearly impenetrable darkness. For a few minutes, there was nothing but silence. Even the usual rustle of night creatures was absent, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. They could feel the oppressive weight of the woods pressing in, alive with the ominous sense that they were not alone. Every sound, every slight movement, sent ripples of terror through the group, though they remained silent, too afraid to disturb the stillness. Margaret clutched her daughter tightly, stroking her hair to keep her calm, though her own fear was barely contained. "Mama," the girl whispered, her voice tiny and tremulous. "Will it find us?" Margaret hesitated, swallowing hard, then managed a soft, unconvincing reassurance. "No, darling. We're safe here." But even as she said it, her gaze flicked nervously to the trapper, hoping for a sign of certainty that he could not give. The trapper peered cautiously out of the narrow opening, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. His eyes strained against the dark, but the forest outside was a wall of blackness. His mind churned with possibilities, each one darker than the last. The creature could be anywhere, hidden just beyond the edge of sight, waiting with a patience that defied reason. He couldn't shake the feeling that it knew exactly where they were, and worse, that it was merely waiting for the right moment to make its move. After a few tense moments, a low, almost imperceptible sound drifted into the crevice, a slow, rhythmic breathing, deep and measured. It was close, far too close. They looked at one another, eyes wide with dread, each one silently pleading for this nightmare to end. The sound grew louder, moving around the outside of the rock, encircling their small shelter like a predator pacing its prey. Elias pressed his hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp, his whole body shaking. He felt helpless, a feeling that gnawed at his spirit. They were trapped, pinned like animals, unable to flee or fight. He tried to look away from the entrance, to ignore the terrible sound outside, but the fear was all-consuming, tightening around him like a vice. The breathing stopped suddenly, replaced by a silence so thick it was nearly suffocating. The seconds stretched, each one heavy with anticipation, as they waited, eyes fixed on the entrance, praying that whatever was out there had moved on. But then, from directly outside, came a scraping sound, a claw or a hand dragging slowly across the stone. It wasn't an attack. It was a taunt, a deliberate reminder that the creature knew exactly where they were hiding. Margaret pulled her daughter closer, whispering a prayer, her voice trembling with desperation. The child buried her face in her mother's shoulder, trying to block out the sounds, but they felt impossible to escape. Every scrape of claws on stone, every breath that rasped just beyond the walls of their sanctuary, seemed to seep into their bones, branding them with a fear they would never forget. Suddenly, the trapper raised a finger to his lips, signaling absolute silence. The creature had stopped moving and all was quiet again. They strained their ears, listening, hoping against hope that it had finally left. But in the stillness, they heard a faint, terrible sound, a low, throaty chuckle, deep and resonant, echoing from the shadows. It was a sound of amusement, of satisfaction, as if the creature knew it had them exactly where it wanted. The laugh faded, but its implications lingered, hanging in the air like a curse. They were not dealing with a mere animal. This was something darker, something with a mind sharp and cruel, that took pleasure in their fear. As the echoes of that chilling laughter died away, they were left in the heavy, suffocating silence of their narrow stone refuge, knowing that they had only bought themselves a little time. The creature was still out there, waiting, and it would not let them go. The settlers sat in their cramped refuge, each of them gripped by the overwhelming terror that had seized their hearts. The chilling laughter, which had reverberated through the clearing just moments before, lingered in their minds, refusing to fade. They couldn't shake the impression that they were dealing with something far more sinister than they had imagined, something that seemed almost human in its cruel amusement, yet more monstrous than anything they had ever encountered. In the blackness beyond, the creature waited, aware of their every breath, every terrified heartbeat. The trapper was the first to break the silence, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't stay here forever. It's playing with us, and sooner or later it'll tire of the game." His words hit them with the harshness of reality. As terrifying as the forest felt, they knew that staying in their narrow shelter was only delaying the inevitable. They were trapped in its territory, an unforgiving domain ruled by a creature that seemed to relish their fear, drawing them into a deadly dance they couldn't escape. Samuel, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed, muttered, "Then what do you suggest, Trapper? Do we just walk out there and face it? Let it pick us off one by one?" The Trapper glanced at Samuel, his own fear visible but tempered by a resolve he had honed from years of surviving an unforgiving wilderness. "No," he replied slowly, a plan forming as he spoke. "We don't let it hunt us on its terms. We find a way to change the rules. I've seen animals turn on predators, confuse them. If we can break its pattern, throw it off, we might have a chance." The others listened, hanging on his words, desperate for any sliver of hope. The Trapper continued, "We need to move quietly, stick together, and stay alert. We find a way through this forest, keep the creature guessing. If we can break its line of sight, maybe, just maybe, we'll throw it off long enough to make it out." A plan, however frail, was better than cowering helplessly in the crevice. With renewed purpose, they steeled themselves, gathering their meager belongings and preparing to venture back into the forest. Every creak of leather, every scrape of cloth against stone seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The Trapper took the lead, his movements deliberate and cautious as he eased them out of the rocky shelter and into the darkened woods. The night had thickened into an almost unnatural blackness, pressing in on them as they moved between the trees. The air was heavy, laced with the earthy scent of damp leaves and the sharp, lingering tang of decay. Step by step, they slipped through the underbrush, each footfall carefully placed, their breaths held, as if the creature could sense even the faintest sound. They hadn't gone far when they heard it again. A soft rustling, just off to the left, as if something large were gliding through the undergrowth beside them. Margaret clutched her daughter's hand tightly, her heart racing, eyes darting wildly through the shadows, but she kept her pace steady, refusing to break from the group. The Trapper paused, motioning for them to stop. He scanned the darkness, listening intently. The rustling stopped, and for a brief moment, an eerie silence settled over the forest. Then, with an uncanny slowness, they caught a glimpse of movement, a faint shadow flitting between the trees, its outline barely visible against the inky blackness. It was the creature, tracking them, shadowing their every step with an unsettling patience. The settlers clung closer to one another, their movements synchronized by the instinctual terror that pulsed through them. They pressed on, each step forward feeling like a small triumph against the fear that gnawed at their minds. But the creature's shadow stayed just within sight, shifting along with them, like a dark specter haunting their every move. Elias, his face pale and strained, whispered, "It's still watching us. No matter what we do, it's always there." The Trapper shot him a hard look. "Stay focused. If we panic now, we're finished." His voice, though quiet, held a stern command that kept them moving forward, one shaky step at a time. They tightened their formation, each of them daring to hope that somehow they might make it through the forest before the creature struck again. But as they reached a slight clearing, the shadow shifted abruptly, moving ahead of them, blocking their path with silent intent. The faint glimmer of its eyes caught the thin moonlight, locking onto them with a chilling intelligence that stopped them in their tracks. There was no more circling, no more game of pursuit. It had tired of watching, of taunting. For a moment that stretched infinitely, they stood frozen, staring into the eyes of the beast that had brought them to the edge of their own fear. It let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that seemed to ripple through the ground beneath their feet. And in that instant, they realized with a sickening clarity that there was no escape. They were caught in a nightmare come to life, and the creature was done with toying. The settlers stood rooted in place, each one of them locked in the creature's cold, calculating gaze. The low growl that had rumbled through the clearing seemed to vibrate in their bones, freezing them in a primal, helpless terror. This was it, the moment they dreaded, where there was no turning back, no crevice or rock formation to shield them. They were exposed, their courage stripped away, as vulnerable as prey caught in a snare. The Trapper was the first to break free from the paralysis, his voice hoarse and trembling, but resolute. "Form a circle, keep your backs to each other. Don't let it split us up." His command cut through the fear, snapping the others back into motion, and they clumsily obeyed, shifting to form a tight circle in the center of the clearing, facing outward. Margaret clutched her daughter close, shielding her as best she could, whispering words of comfort that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Samuel held his axe up, though his hands shook so violently that it seemed a greater weight than he could bear. Elias gripped his hunting knife, his face pale and drawn, barely managing to steady his trembling hand. The trapper stood firm, his expression steely, though his eyes betrayed a shadow of fear. Together, they formed a fragile defense, a last, desperate attempt to appear stronger than they felt. The creature watched them, its eyes gleaming with something that looked disturbingly like amusement. It stood just outside the reach of their makeshift circle, studying them with an intelligence that sent chills down their spines. Slowly, it began to pace around them, moving with a fluid grace that seemed more shadow than flesh. Each step it took was deliberate, a reminder of the power it held over them, as if savoring the fear radiating from their trembling bodies. Elias's voice cracked as he whispered, "What does it want from us? Why won't it just end this?" The trapper, his gaze fixed on the creature, replied softly, "It's in control. This isn't just hunting, it's something worse. It's drawing out the fear, watching us break." His words hung in the air, a grim realization that settled heavily on them all. The creature wasn't in a hurry, it was savoring this, taking pleasure in their helplessness. With a sudden, heart-stopping movement, the creature lunged forward, just close enough to send a shiver of panic through the group, then retreated, circling them again, as though testing their reactions. The settlers flinched, stumbling as they tried to hold their ground, each one painfully aware of how thin their courage had worn. The creature continued its taunting dance, each feint and lunge a cruel reminder of its dominance, its power. Samuel, his face twisted in desperation, could no longer contain his fear. "We can't just stand here," he shouted, his voice wild with panic. "We need to run, split up, anything but just waiting here to die." The trapper shot him a fierce glare. "You run, and it'll pick us off one by one. That's what it wants. We stay together, we're harder prey. It might think twice before attacking." But as he spoke, the creature let out another low, guttural growl, as if understanding their conversation, as if mocking their hope of surviving the night. Its eyes locked onto Samuel, narrowing in a way that made his blood run cold. Samuel staggered back, his defiance dissolving into terror, realizing in that instant that he had drawn its attention. The creature lowered itself slightly, muscles coiling, preparing to strike, and Samuel stumbled backward, raising his axe in a futile attempt to defend himself. Before he could scream, it lunged forward, faster than any of them could have anticipated, its massive, clawed hands slashing through the air toward him. But the trapper reacted with surprising speed, stepping forward, swinging his knife with a fierce determination that belied his fear. His blade sliced through the air, grazing the creature's arm just enough to throw off its aim. It reared back, snarling in pain and fury, momentarily retreating to the edge of the clearing, its gaze now smoldering with a feral rage. The brief confrontation left the settlers gasping, their hearts pounding in their chests. The trapper kept his knife raised, his stance defensive, his voice steady but strained. "If we're going down, we don't make it easy. We fight." The creature let out a bone-chilling snarl, its patience clearly running thin. It stepped forward again, more menacing than ever, its intent unmistakable. The settlers braced themselves, each one gripping their makeshift weapons, knowing this was likely the final stand. The trapper took a deep breath, his voice a low, fierce whisper. "Hold steady. Whatever happens, don't break the circle." They stood together, backs to each other, facing the encroaching darkness, as the creature prepared to close in on them once more, the weight of inevitability pressing down on them like a shadow. The creature circled them slowly, its massive form drifting in and out of the shadows, each step deliberate, like a predator savoring its control over cornered prey. The settlers clung to one another in their makeshift circle, the cold night air biting at their skin, breaths shallow and rapid. Their only defense was each other, a thin line of humanity against the dark, ancient force that stalked them. The trapper kept his gaze fixed on the creature, every muscle in his body tense, knife held tightly at his side. He could feel the fear pulsing from the others, their shoulders brushing together as they huddled, an instinctual need for closeness in the face of the unknown. His mind raced, searching for a plan, but the primal instinct to survive overshadowed all logic. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to run. All they had was this fragile formation and each other. The creature stopped suddenly, its head tilting in a disturbingly human gesture, as if studying them with a dark curiosity. Its glowing eyes narrowed, and then it let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that deepened into something almost like a laugh, a grotesque sound that twisted through the clearing, rattling their very bones. The settlers shuddered, a chill seeping into their souls. It was mocking them, reminding them of their powerlessness. Suddenly, Samuel's nerve broke, his body tensed, and without warning, he tore himself from the circle, a mad panic overtaking his senses. "I can't just stand here. I have to get out of here," he shouted, voice breaking with desperation. "Samuel." "No," the trapper yelled, reaching out to stop him, but it was too late. Samuel bolted into the trees, his frantic footsteps echoing through the forest as he disappeared into the darkness. The creature's head whipped toward him, eyes gleaming with a hungry light. It waited a heartbeat, savoring the moment, and then it moved with a terrifying speed, vanishing into the shadows after him. The forest swallowed the sounds of its pursuit, leaving the remaining settlers in an aching, deathly silence, each of them too stunned to move or speak. Margaret clung to her daughter, her face etched with horror, her gaze fixed on the spot where Samuel had vanished. They all stood there, frozen, unable to comprehend the fate that had just befallen him. The trapper clenched his jaw, his face a mask of grief and rage, as he realized the mistake they had made by letting fear divide them. After a few heart-pounding minutes, a faint sound drifted back through the trees. A scream, sharp and filled with a terror so raw it cut through the night like a blade. The settlers flinched, but there was nothing they could do. The scream faded quickly, swallowed by the forest, leaving only the echo in their minds. "We stick together, no matter what," the trapper said firmly, his voice barely holding steady. "That's what it wants, to break us apart, pick us off one by one. We're safer as one." Elias nodded, though his face was pale and drawn, and he looked around the circle, his eyes pleading with the others to hold their ground. "Please, we have to stay close. Samuel didn't stand a chance alone. We can't let it happen again." The fear in his voice cut through them all, a stark reminder of what they faced. Slowly, they reformed the circle, pressing closer together, their hands gripping their weapons with renewed determination. The fire in their eyes wasn't just fear now. It was a spark of defiance, a resolve to survive, if only to honor the lives that had already been lost. They stayed that way, locked in their tight formation, each one listening intently for the creature's return. The forest around them was silent, an unnatural stillness that made their skin crawl. They knew it was out there, lurking just beyond the trees, watching them with a patience that felt infinite. But for now, it remained hidden, letting the horror of what had just happened sink into their bones. As dawn approached, a faint light began to break over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. The dim rays illuminated their faces, streaked with grime and exhaustion, but also with a glimmer of hope. They hadn't succumbed to panic. They hadn't scattered. They had faced the darkness together and endured. The trapper took a deep, steadying breath and looked around at the weary faces of his companions. "We move at first light," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Together. No one breaks off, no matter what." They nodded, unified by a shared understanding, a pact of survival. The creature had shown them what would happen if they faltered, if they let fear control them. And now, with the first light of dawn piercing through the forest, they were determined to make their stand. For the first time, they felt a glimmer of strength in their unity, a defiance that burned quietly in each of them. The creature might be watching, waiting for its next move, but they wouldn't make it easy. They would leave the forest as they had entered it. Together, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, the settlers pulled themselves together, gathering their few belongings with quiet urgency. The fear of the night had not faded, but in the dim light of morning it felt manageable, the monstrous presence looming at the edges of their minds rather than pressing in on them from every shadow. They moved with the exhaustion of people who had seen too much, yet their resolve held firm. They had survived the night, and now they would push forward, their steps united by a fierce, silent determination. The trapper led the way, his eyes scanning the terrain, every sense alert to the forest around them. Though dawn had come, the trees were thick here, their canopy dense, and the light struggled to reach them, casting an uneasy half-light over the path. The group moved in a tight formation, closer than before, each member keeping pace with the person beside them, their silence heavy with unspoken promises. They were committed to each other now. The horror of the previous night had stripped away any lingering doubts. For hours, they trudged through the underbrush, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves and earth. The forest was eerily quiet, as if even the birds and animals had withdrawn, leaving only the unsettling emptiness around them. They could feel the creature's absence as much as they had felt its presence the night before, a gnawing unease that made each step feel like a gamble. They knew it was still out there, watching, biding its time. The morning light was no shield. It was merely a pause, a chance to regroup before the next strike. After a while, Elias stumbled upon a small creek cutting through the forest, its water clear and cold. The settlers gratefully knelt beside it, scooping handfuls of water to their parched lips, the coolness of it easing some of the tension in their weary bodies. For a brief, fragile moment, the presence of the stream felt like a blessing, a reminder that there was still life and purity in this forest, despite the darkness that lurked within it. Margaret knelt beside her daughter, helping her drink, her fingers gently combing through the child's hair, a grounding gesture that steadied them both. Elias filled a canteen, his gaze distant as he looked over the water's edge into the dense trees beyond. The trapper stood back, his eyes never leaving the surrounding woods, his hand still gripping his knife. "We don't linger," he murmured, though he allowed them a few more moments to rest. He knew their strength was wearing thin, and every pause felt like a risk, yet pressing onward without some reprieve might lead to a mistake. And mistakes, he knew, were fatal in a place like this. Just as they began to rise, an unmistakable rustling sounded from the trees behind them. It was faint, distant, but enough to freeze them in place. They exchanged glances, and without a word, they slipped back into their tight formation, each one steeling themselves for what might come next. They waited, breaths held, as the forest seemed to hold its breath with them. The rustling grew louder, closer, each sound resonating like a drumbeat of dread. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, leaving them standing in a silence that was somehow worse than the noise itself. The trapper, his expression grim, motioned for them to keep moving. "It's toying with us again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Testing us. We keep steady. Don't give it what it wants." They nodded, though each step forward now felt heavy, their earlier resolve shaken by the reminder that they were being watched, pursued by a creature with a patience as vast and unyielding as the forest itself. The creek's gentle flow now felt like a taunt, its calmness a stark contrast to the terror they felt pressing in around them. As they moved deeper, the rustling returned, this time circling them, a maddening rhythm that stayed just beyond their line of sight. It was relentless, an unyielding presence that mirrored their every step, never closing in but never retreating. The creature was there, shadowing them with a terrifying precision, as if waiting for the exact moment when their strength would falter. The trapper clenched his jaw, his pace unbreaking. "It's only fear," he said, more to himself than the others. "We've survived this long. We'll keep going. It won't break us." But the others could hear the strain in his voice, the uncertainty that had crept in despite his best efforts. They all felt it, that hollow dread that whispered in the back of their minds, telling them that the creature would not be satisfied until it had worn them down completely. And so they walked on, steps weary but determined, their breaths shallow, minds locked in a fierce battle to ignore the constant reminder that their every movement, every decision was being watched, judged, toyed with. Each glance exchanged among them was filled with unspoken fears and fragile hopes, a silent agreement that whatever happened, they would face it together. But the unrelenting rustle of footsteps behind them reminded them with chilling clarity. They were no longer just travelers in these woods. They were prey. The hours dragged on as the settlers pushed deeper into the forest, their bodies aching and minds fraying under the strain of the relentless pursuit. Every step felt heavier, each breath harder to catch. The creature's presence had become an unyielding shadow, circling them, watching, waiting. The sense of being hunted weighed on them with a crushing intensity, a constant reminder that they were being driven, cornered, like animals. The trapper took the lead, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the trees with a desperate focus. His determination was a fragile thread holding them together, but even he was beginning to falter. The others could see it. The stiffness in his shoulders, the twitch of his gaze, the quiet moments when he seemed to look past them, as if searching for an escape that he knew didn't exist. Elias's voice broke the silence, a low murmur laced with exhaustion. "How much further?" he asked, his eyes hollow, dark circles etched beneath them. "It feels like we're going nowhere, just moving in circles." The trapper glanced back, a flicker of regret crossing his face. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The forest, it's like it's leading us. No matter how far we go, we just end up back in its grasp." Margaret pulled her daughter closer, her lips pressed into a thin line. The child had long since fallen silent, her small face blank with fatigue and fear. Margaret's gaze hardened as she looked at the others. "We can't stop now," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "We keep moving. We can't let it win." The trapper nodded, appreciating her resolve, even as he shared the same hopelessness gnawing at them all. But they had little choice. Stopping felt like surrendering, like lying down and accepting the creature's dark game. So they pressed on, the forest closing in around them, its dense foliage dampening every sound, every breath. The rustling resumed, closer this time, each snap of a branch echoing louder, sharper, as if the creature were drawing nearer with each step. The settlers could feel it now, an oppressive weight pressing in on them, the certainty that the creature was tired of waiting. Their pulse quickened, fear racing through them as they exchanged glances, understanding the unspoken truth. The creature's patience was gone. It was ready to make its move. Without warning, a deep growl rumbled through the trees, reverberating through the ground beneath their feet. It was no longer a distant taunt. It was a challenge, a declaration of its intent. The settlers froze, hearts pounding as the sound grew closer, the vibrations shaking them to their core. Elias's hands trembled as he gripped his hunting knife, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. "What do we do?" he whispered, his gaze darting to the trapper. It's coming for us. It's not playing anymore." The trapper met his eyes, his own fear stark and raw. He drew in a deep breath, forcing himself to speak with as much calm as he could muster. "We stand together. We don't run. If it comes, we make it fight for every inch." They clustered closer, forming a protective ring, each one holding their makeshift weapons with trembling hands. They were weary, nearly broken, but the terror of scattering, of being picked off one by one, kept them rooted in place. They would not give in to the creature's game, no matter how badly it wanted to see them flee in panic. The creature's growls grew louder, its massive form becoming visible in the shadows, a hulking shape that seemed to blur into the darkness around it. It moved slowly, each step heavy, deliberate, savoring the fear radiating from them. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, two burning orbs that held a hunger beyond anything they could comprehend. Margaret clutched her daughter close, whispering frantic reassurances that rang hollow even to her own ears. "Stay calm," she murmured, though her heart hammered in her chest. "We're together. We're strong together." The creature stopped just at the edge of their circle, its gaze sweeping over each of them with a chilling intelligence. For a long, agonizing moment, it stood there, watching, waiting, as if daring them to break, to scatter. They held their ground, every muscle tensed, bracing for the inevitable, for the final moment when it would strike. Then, in a move so swift they could barely react, the creature lunged forward, its claws outstretched, a blur of muscle and fury. The trapper reacted instinctively, stepping forward, his knife flashing in the faint light as he slashed at the creature's outstretched arm. His blade made contact, and the creature recoiled with a furious roar, blood darkening its fur. But it was only a brief victory. The creature's rage was palpable, a force that washed over them like a wave, pressing them back, suffocating them. They could feel the strength draining from their limbs, their breaths shallow, minds clouded with terror. And in that moment, they knew the creature would not stop until it had them all. The creature's roar reverberated through the forest, a sound so primal and fierce it seemed to shake the very trees around them. The settlers stumbled back, holding their ground but barely, their formation fragile under the force of the creature's rage. The trapper, his face pale and determined, held his knife steady, though he knew it was a meager weapon against a beast of such strength. Each one of them felt it in their bones. The creature was finished toying with them. This was the end game. For a moment, everything was still, as if even the forest had paused to bear witness to their final stand. The creature stood at the edge of their circle, its massive body heaving, eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made the air feel thick, oppressive. They could see the glint of blood where the trapper's knife had struck, but the wound only seemed to fuel its fury, its need to assert its dominance. Margaret held her daughter close, whispering words of comfort that neither of them truly believed. The child clung to her, eyes wide with terror, her small hands gripping her mother's dress with white-knuckled desperation. Elias, standing beside them, gripped his knife with trembling hands, his face a mask of fear and determination. He knew they had no real chance, but he would fight, if only to protect the others for a few precious seconds. The trapper glanced around the circle, meeting each person's eyes, a silent exchange of courage and resolve passing between them. "If we're going down," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper, "we go down together. Hold steady." With a sudden, terrifying speed, the creature lunged at them, its claws swiping through the air with deadly intent. They scattered, barely dodging its reach, but managed to reform their circle, each one swinging their makeshift weapons in desperate arcs to keep it at bay. The creature growled, its frustration evident as it circled them again, seeking a gap, a moment of weakness. Samuel, who had barely kept his fear in check, stumbled backward, his back pressing against a tree. The creature's eyes locked onto him, sensing his vulnerability, and it lunged again, claws outstretched. But Elias sprang forward, his knife slashing through the air, and though the blade barely grazed the creature's hide, it was enough to draw its attention away from Samuel. The creature snarled, rearing back in pain and fury, its eyes now fixed on Elias with a murderous intent. Elias, his heart pounding, stepped back, his gaze never leaving the creature. He knew he was no match for it, but if he could buy even a few moments for the others, he would. Margaret, seeing the creature's focus shift to Elias, seized the chance to shield her daughter behind her. She whispered a hurried prayer, her voice trembling, and pressed her daughter's face against her chest to block her view of the horror unfolding. The trapper, sensing the creature's next move, stepped forward, knife raised, his expression fierce with a desperate resolve. "Come on," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Come after me." He lunged at the creature, slashing with all his strength, his movements quick and unyielding. His blade connected, carving a shallow cut along the creature's side. It recoiled, hissing, but did not retreat. For the first time, the creature appeared hesitant, as if it recognized the depth of their resistance. It paused, its gaze sweeping over each one of them, calculating. They were weaker, exhausted, but still defiant, their will to survive creating a barrier as potent as any weapon. The creature's intelligence was undeniable. It knew that it could overpower them, but it seemed almost curious now, perhaps even wary of the ferocity these humans displayed despite their fear. The settlers stood their ground, their breaths coming in gasps, their bodies tense and ready. They had nothing left to lose, and they knew the creature sensed it. They were prepared to fight to their last breath, even if it meant going down one by one. In a final, desperate attempt, the trapper yelled, "Go! Run while it's distracted!" He motioned toward a narrow path between the trees, a barely visible route that twisted through the dense foliage. The others hesitated, torn between the survival instinct and their loyalty to each other. But Margaret seized her daughter's hand, pulling her toward the path. "We have to try," she whispered, her voice thick with fear and determination. Elias and Samuel followed, casting one last look at the trapper, who held his ground, standing between them and the creature, his knife ready. They slipped into the path, hearts racing, their footsteps muffled by the dense undergrowth. Behind them, the creature snarled, its attention momentarily split as it watched its prey scatter. The trapper faced it alone, his form defiant and unyielding, knowing that he had given them a chance, however small. As the settlers ran, the creature hesitated, caught between pursuing the group and confronting the man who had dared to wound it. The trapper's stance was steady, his knife glinting in the faint light, mummified, a final act of courage in the face of insurmountable odds. And with a deep rumbling growl, the creature lunged. The settlers sprinted down the narrow path, branches clawing at their clothes and undergrowth tangling at their feet as they pushed forward, driven by the desperate hope that they might finally escape the nightmare that had haunted them. Margaret led her daughter with fierce determination, her hand gripping the child's tightly as she navigated the twisting route through the trees. Elias and Samuel ran just behind her, breaths coming in ragged gasps, glancing back over their shoulders to catch any sign of pursuit. The forest seemed endless, each shadow a potential threat, every sound a reminder of the creature that had hunted them. Behind them, the trapper fought alone, holding his ground as the creature bore down upon him. He moved with a steady resolve, wielding his knife with a skill honed by years of survival, but he knew he was outmatched. Each swing was an act of defiance, each dodge a declaration of his will to protect the others. The creature's fury was palpable, a dark energy that filled the clearing, but he refused to retreat, determined to give the others as much time as he could. The settlers could hear distant sounds of struggle, the trapper's shouts, the creature's enraged growls, and their hearts ached, knowing that he had chosen to stay behind. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't slow her pace, knowing that he had made his sacrifice so that she and the others might live. She pushed forward, clinging to her daughter, every step a promise that his bravery would not be in vain. At last, the path opened up to the edge of the forest, revealing a narrow clearing bathed in the soft light of dawn. They burst through the trees, stumbling out into the open, the fresh air a shocking contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of the woods. For the first time in hours, they felt the weight lift, even if only slightly, and the world seemed to breathe with them, filling them with a fragile sense of freedom. But as they turned back, looking into the dark forest from which they had emerged, the sounds of the trapper's struggle faded into a heavy silence. The forest stood still, as if swallowing up any trace of his final stand. Elias shook his head, his face pale, haunted. "He gave us a chance," he murmured, his voice choked with grief. We have to keep going, for him." Margaret nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, and gripped her daughter's hand even tighter. The girl, sensing the gravity of the moment, looked up at her mother with wide, sorrowful eyes, understanding that they were leaving something, someone, behind. They moved away from the forest's edge, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the place where they had witnessed so much terror. The quiet open space was a stark contrast to the horrors they had endured, yet none of them could shake the lingering sense that they were still being watched. The memory of the creature's eyes, the way it had toyed with them, remained fresh and vivid, a reminder that the wilderness held secrets darker than any they could comprehend. When they had gone a fair distance, Samuel finally spoke, breaking the silence that had bound them since their escape. "We don't tell anyone," he said, his voice firm, eyes fixed on the horizon. "No one would believe us. They'd just come looking, and we can't lead them back there." The others nodded, each recognizing the terrible truth of his words. Their story would go untold, their encounter buried with the silence of the forest. It was a pact, a silent understanding that they would carry this horror alone, a secret to protect others from the nightmare that lurked in the heart of the woods. Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her expression softening, if only slightly. "We'll remember him," she whispered, looking to the others. "He saved us. We carry that with us." And so, with weary steps and heavy hearts, they turned away, leaving the dark forest behind them, its secrets intact, its horrors hidden. The sun rose higher, casting a warm light over the land as they moved toward whatever lay ahead. But even as they ventured into the safety of the open plains, each of them knew they would never truly leave the forest. It would live on in their minds, in their dreams, a shadow that stretched across their lives, a reminder of the things that watched from the darkness and the brave soul who had made sure they'd see the light of day again.